Listen to the wind. On the vast frozen plains of Central Asia, the wind doesn't just blow, it whispers. It carries the scent of dry grass, horse sweat, and, if you listen closely enough, the lingering echo of a 1,000-year-old terror. For the civilizations of the 13th century, from the high-walled cities of China to the grand libraries of Persia and the knights of Eastern Europe, that wind carried a sound that meant the end of the world. It was the rhythmic, rolling thunder of tens of thousands of small, sturdy horses ridden by men who didn't just fight war, they lived it. They called him the Wrath of God, the Scourge of the Earth, a monster who built mountains of human skulls and turned fertile valleys into graveyards. But to see Genghis Khan only as a bloodthirsty barbarian is to make the same fatal mistake his enemies did. It is to miss the terrifying, cold-blooded genius of the man. Genghis Khan did not conquer the world simply because his warriors were the best archers or the fastest riders, though they were. He conquered the world because he understood the human mind better than any king or emperor who ever lived. He realized that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is not the sword, but fear. He turned psychological warfare into a precise industrial science. He weaponized rumors, staged elaborate deceptions, and committed acts of such calculated, overwhelming brutality that entire nations surrendered before a single Mongol arrow was even notched. He was a man who rose from the literal dirt, an outcast boy eating rats to survive, to become the master of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. He was a man who broke the world and then rebuilt it in his own image. This is not just a story of conquest. This is a journey into the mind of a predator who saw empires not as obstacles, but as prey. This is the story of how one man's terrifying genius changed the course of history forever. This is the story of the Great Khan. Before he was the universal ruler, before his name made the very ground shake, he was a ghost, a boy named Temujin, born into a world of endless grass and casual, everyday violence. To understand the man who would eventually burn cities to the ground, you must first understand the child who watched his world be stripped away before he could even grow a beard. His story begins not in a palace, but in a cold, wind-blasted tent on the edge of the Onon River in 1162. Legend says he was born clutching a blood clot the size of a knucklebone in his tiny fist, a sign, the shamans whispered, that this child was destined to be a shedder of blood. But in the Mongolian steppe, blood was the only currency that mattered. Temujin's father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man of status who had stolen Temujin's mother, Hoelun, from a rival tribe. In the steppe, life was a cycle of theft and retribution. When Temujin was only 9 years old, the cycle caught up with them. While traveling to arrange a marriage for his son, Yesugei was invited to a meal by a group of Tatars. In a world governed by the sacred laws of hospitality, the Tatars offered him food and seasoned it with slow-acting poison. Yesugei died shortly after returning to his camp, leaving his family leaderless in a world that had no mercy for the weak. What followed was the defining trauma of Temujin's life. His own clan, the Taichiud, saw the widow and her young children as a burden. In a move of staggering cruelty, they waited until the family was away from the main camp, then packed up and moved, abandoning Hoelun and her 7 children to the wilderness. They left them with nothing, no livestock, no horses, no protection. In the Mongolian winter, this was a death sentence, but they didn't die. Hoelun, a woman of iron will, kept her children alive by sheer desperation. They lived like scavengers. Temujin, the future conqueror of millions, spent his formative years digging for roots, catching small fish in the freezing river, and hunting marmots and rats. It was in this period of starvation and isolation that the boy's mind began to harden. He learned the first and most important lesson of the steppe. Loyalty is a lie, and the only person you can truly trust is yourself, and those you have bound to you through blood and shared suffering. It was during this time that Temujin committed his first act of calculated, lethal violence. His half-brother, Bekta, was the eldest and began to assert his dominance over the small family, stealing the meager food Temujin and his brother Kasar worked so hard to find. To any other boy, this might have been a sibling rivalry. To Temujin, it was an existential threat. He saw that if Bekta were allowed to rule through bullying, the family would eventually fracture and perish. So, he dealt with it with the same cold logic he would later apply to empires. He and Kasar tracked Bekta to a small hill where he was sitting alone. They approached him from two sides, like hunters closing in on a wolf. Despite Bekta's pleas for his life, Temujin and Kasar riddled their half-brother with arrows. Temujin didn't kill out of rage. He killed out of a cold necessity for order. When he returned to the tent, his mother was horrified, calling him a beast and a killer. But Temujin remained silent. He had learned that, in a world of predators, you must be the apex predator, or you will be consumed. He had removed a source of friction, and from that moment on, he was the undisputed head of his household. But the world wasn't done trying to break him. The Taichi Ud, hearing that the abandoned family had survived, grew nervous. They sent a raiding party to capture Temujin. He was taken prisoner, fitted with a heavy wooden collar, a kang, that prevented him from using his hands or seeing his own feet. He was treated like a dog, paraded through the camps of his enemies, a humiliated slave. But even in the collar, Temujin was watching. He was learning. He studied the internal politics of the clan that had betrayed him. He identified the people who were dissatisfied, the people who showed him small kindnesses. One night, during a festival when his captors were drunk, Temujin used the heavy wooden collar as a weapon, smashing it into the face of his guard and fleeing into the dark. He hid in the reeds of a river, submerging his body in the freezing water, with only his nose above the surface, while his pursuers searched the banks. He was eventually saved by a sympathetic servant of the clan who had seen the strength in the boy's eyes. This escape was more than just a survival story. It was the birth of his legend. Word began to spread across the steppe of the boy who wouldn't die, the boy who had killed his brother for order and escaped the Taichi Ud while wearing their chains. This was the foundation of his psychological power. People began to believe that Temujin was protected by the eternal blue sky, that he was a man of destiny. Temujin realized that to survive, he needed a protector. He sought out Togrul, the Khan of the Kharash tribe, and an old blood brother, Anda, of his father. He presented Togrul with a magnificent sable coat, the only valuable item his family possessed, as a gesture of loyalty. In return, Togrul accepted him as a son. This was Temujin's first major political masterstroke. He had successfully traded a piece of fur for the protection of one of the most powerful men on the steppe. With Togrul's backing, Temujin began to gather a small following. He didn't just recruit based on tribal ties, which was the ancient custom. He recruited based on merit and absolute loyalty. He attracted the men of the long shadow, outcasts, orphans, and lower-class warriors who had no place in the rigid, aristocratic tribal system. To them, Temujin was one of their own. He promised them a world where a man's worth was measured by his courage and his service, not his birth. He was building a new kind of clan, a brotherhood of the desperate, forged in the same fire that had tempered him. The first true test of his new power came when the Merkit tribe, the very tribe his father had stolen his mother from, launched a retaliatory raid. They captured Temujin's young wife, Borte. Temujin was forced to flee, watching from the mountains as his wife was carried away. For a Mongol, this was the ultimate humiliation. But Temujin didn't lash out in a blind rage. He waited. He gathered his allies, Togrul and his own childhood friend Jamuka. Together, they launched a massive, coordinated night raid on the Merkit camp. The rescue of Borte was a total success, but it was also a moment of profound personal crisis. When they found her, she was pregnant, and there was no way of knowing if the child was Temujin's or a Merkit rapist's. In the brutal world of the steppe, most men would have rejected the child and the wife, but Temujin, remembering his mother's own history, accepted both. He named the boy Jochi, the guest, and treated him as his eldest son. This act of pragmatism and compassion further solidified the loyalty of his followers. He was a leader who chose stability and family over the petty dictates of tribal honor. By the late 1180s, the boy who had eaten rats in the river was a rising power. But as his influence grew, so did the friction with his blood brother, Jamuka. They were two sides of the same coin, both brilliant, both ambitious. But while Jamuka believed in the old ways of the aristocracy and tribal purity, Temujin believed in the new world of meritocracy and absolute centralized power. The stage was set for a civil war that would decide the fate of the Mongolian people. Temujin had spent his youth being unmade by the world. Now, he was ready to start unmaking the world in return. The predator had finished his apprenticeship in the shadows. Now, he was ready to step into the sun. The unification of the Mongolian tribes was not a diplomatic achievement. It was a violent psychological surgery performed on the soul of a nation. For centuries, the high plateau of Central Asia had been a chaotic cauldron of blood feuds, shifting alliances, and endless small-scale warfare. The tribes, the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Karaites, and the Mongols, were locked in a zero-sum game of survival, their loyalties tied strictly to the narrow interests of their own bloodlines. Into this fractured world, Temujin brought a vision that was as radical as it was terrifying. He didn't want to just lead a tribe. He wanted to dissolve the very idea of the tribe and replace it with something far more potent. Absolute, centralized loyalty to the great Khan. The crucible for this transformation was his relationship with Jamuka, his childhood Anda, or blood brother. In their youth, they had played together on the banks of the Onon, twice swearing eternal loyalty to each other. They were the two brightest stars in the Mongolian sky, but they represented two fundamentally different philosophies of power. Jamuka was the champion of the Arat, the traditional aristocracy. He believed that power belonged to those of noble birth, and that the old tribal structures were sacred. Temujin, the outcast who had survived on rats and fish, knew that birthright was a fragile shield. He believed in merit, that a shepherd who showed courage in battle was worth more than a prince who showed none. The split between the two brothers is one of the most poignant and significant moments in world history. Legend tells that as their combined camp was on the move, Jamuka suggested they camp near the mountains to provide better shelter for the horses of the nobles, while Temujin suggested they camp near the river to provide better water for the livestock of the commoners. It was a subtle, coded argument about who truly mattered in their new society. That night, Temujin didn't argue. He waited until the camp was asleep, then silently signaled his followers to pack their tents. Under the cover of darkness, Temujin led his people away from Jamuka's camp. When the sun rose, Jamuka awoke to find half his followers gone. The steppe storm had begun its first rotation. This was not just a political split. It was the start of a decades-long psychological duel. Jamuka, enraged by the betrayal, sought to crush Temujin through traditional means. In their first major confrontation, the Battle of Dalan Balzut, Jamuka emerged victorious. To celebrate his victory and send a clear, terrifying message to Temujin's followers, Jamuka committed an act of public atrocity that would eventually backfire. He boiled 70 young Mongol captives alive in massive bronze cauldrons. To Jamuka, this was a display of strength. To the people of the steppe, it was an act of unnecessary cruelty that violated the basic human dignity of the warrior class. Temujin, even in defeat, used this psychologically. He framed himself not as a loser, but as the protector of the common soldier against the whims of a sadistic aristocracy. While Jamukha ruled through fear of the leader, Temujin began to build a society ruled by fear of the law and love for the commander. Temujin realized that to build an unstoppable machine, he had to break the old tribal bonds that made armies fragile. He implemented a revolutionary organizational structure based on the decimal system. Units of 10, Arban, 100, Zun, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000, Tumen. But here was the genius. He deliberately mixed men from different tribes within these units. A soldier was no longer a Tatar or a Merkit. He was a member of the 4th Arat of the 2nd Tumen. If one man deserted, his entire unit of 10 was executed. If the unit of 10 failed, the 100 were punished. This created a psychological environment of total, inescapable collective responsibility. It replaced tribal loyalty with a horizontal bond between soldiers and a vertical bond of absolute obedience to the Khan. For the first time in history, a nomad's identity was defined by his position in a military machine, not by the name of his grandfather. This was the birth of the people of the Felt Walls, a unified Mongol nation. To govern this new machine, Temujin created the Yasa, a secret code of laws that focused on order, hygiene, and absolute discipline. Theft, adultery, and the failure to help a comrade in battle were punishable by death. But the Yasa was also strategically inclusive. Temujin, perhaps the most pragmatic ruler in history, declared absolute religious tolerance. He didn't care if a man prayed to Allah, Buddha, Jesus, or the eternal blue sky, as long as that man obeyed the Khan. This wasn't out of a modern sense of liberalism. It was a psychological masterstroke. By removing religious friction, he eliminated one of the primary causes of civil unrest in conquered territories. He turned religion into a private matter and the state into a divine, unquestionable authority. The campaign to eliminate his rivals was a masterclass in the escalation of terror and the rewards of loyalty. When he finally defeated the Tatars, the tribe that had poisoned his father, he performed a cold-blooded demographic execution. He ordered every male Tatar taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel to be beheaded. It was a literal culling of the opposition's future. Yet, in the same breath, he adopted Tatar orphans into his own family and married Tatar noblewomen to his generals. He was erasing the Tatar nation while absorbing its people. He was teaching the steppe that resistance meant total annihilation, but submission meant a seat at the victor's table. One by one, the great powers of the steppe fell to this new, systematic violence. The Karaites were outmaneuvered by a night attack that bypassed their defenses. The Naimans, who relied on their superior numbers and wealth, were broken by Temujin's psychological deceptions. Before the final battle with the Naimans, Temujin ordered every soldier to light 5 campfires at night. The Naiman scouts, looking down from the ridges, reported that the Mongol army was as numerous as the stars. Panic spread through the Naiman camp before the first arrow was even fired. This was the quintessence of the Genghis Khan method. The battle is won in the mind of the enemy long before the physical slaughter begins. Finally, in 1206, the civil wars ended. Jamukha, captured by his own men who hoped for a reward from Temujin, was brought before his old blood brother. Temujin, true to his code of merit and loyalty, executed the traitors who had betrayed their leader, then offered Jamukha a chance to reunite. Jamukha, recognizing that the world had changed and that there was no room for 2 suns in the sky, requested a noble death. Temujin granted it, ordering Jamukha's back to be broken so that his blood would not touch the earth, allowing his spirit to remain intact. With his final rival gone, a massive assembly, a Kurultai, was held at the headwaters of the Onon River. Beneath the 9-legged white banner of the Mongol people, the outcast who had eaten rats was officially proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The steppe was now a single, coiled spring, held in place by the terrifying will of one man. The tribes were gone. The horde was born. But the Mongolian plateau was too small for the ambition Genghis Khan had forged in the river reeds. He looked south toward the sprawling ancient civilization of China, and west toward the rich silk cities of the horizon. He had perfected the art of conquering people. Now he was ready to start conquering the world. The steppe storm was no longer a local weather pattern. It was an atmospheric collapse that was about to sweep across the globe, and its primary weapon would not be the bow, but the shadow of the bow. The genius of Genghis Khan lay in his understanding that the physical destruction of an enemy was only the secondary goal of warfare. The primary objective was the annihilation of the enemy's will to resist. He realized that a soldier who is paralyzed by fear is already dead. A general who is confused by misinformation has already lost, and a city that believes its doom is inevitable will open its gates without a fight. This was not mere brutality. It was the architecture of terror, a sophisticated multi-layered system of psychological warfare that turned the Mongol horde into a spectral force that seemed to be everywhere, know everything, and possess a cruelty that was not human, but divine. At the tactical level, the centerpiece of this architecture was the feigned retreat, known to the Mongols as the Mangudai. To a conventional army, whether the heavily armored knights of Europe or the disciplined infantry of China, the sight of an enemy fleeing in disorder was an irresistible siren song. It appealed to the most basic human instincts, the thrill of the hunt, and the arrogance of perceived victory. Genghis Khan weaponized this instinct. In a typical engagement, a Mongol vanguard would attack with great ferocity, then suddenly, as if seized by panic, they would break and flee. They would discard equipment, leave behind valuable loot, and ride away in apparent chaos. The enemy, believing they had broken the back of the barbarian horde, would break their own disciplined formations to give chase. They would pursue the Mongols for miles, sometimes for days, as their exhaustion grew and their coordination dissolved. Then, at a pre-arranged location, often a valley or a narrow pass where the terrain favored the horse archer, the fleeing Mongols would suddenly wheel their horses around. At that exact moment, hidden columns of fresh Mongol tumens would erupt from the flanks, surrounding the winded and disorganized pursuers. The victory would transform into a slaughterhouse in a heartbeat. The psychological impact of this tactic was devastating. It made every Mongol retreat suspect, and every Roman or Persian pursuit a gamble with death. It turned the enemy's own momentum into the noose that strangled them. But Genghis Khan's psychological reach extended far beyond the battlefield. He was a master of information warfare, using the YAM system, the world's first truly global postal and intelligence network, as his eyes and ears. The YAM consisted of a series of relay stations placed at intervals of 25 to 30 miles, each stocked with fresh horses and supplies. Messengers, riding with their chests and heads tightly bound to endure the physical strain of constant galloping, could cover up to 200 miles a day. This system gave Genghis Khan an information advantage that was almost supernatural in the 13th century. He knew the political climate of a target kingdom, the health of its king, the size of its granaries, and the morale of its people years before his army arrived. He used this information to plant seeds of discord. He sent spies and merchants into foreign cities to spread rumors of the horde's invincibility and their supposed demonic origins. They whispered that the Mongols were the Tatars, the people from Tartarus, the Greek hell. They told stories of the Khan's warriors eating human flesh and drinking the blood of their horses. By the time the dust cloud of the Mongol vanguard appeared on the horizon, the population of the city was already mentally broken, half convinced that they were facing a supernatural judgment rather than a mortal army. When Genghis Khan moved against a fortified city, his psychological toolkit expanded into the realm of the macabre. He understood that the greatest fear of a besieged population is the fear of what happens when the walls finally fall. He used this to create a brutal binary choice: surrender immediately and be spared, and taxed, or resist and be erased from history. To ensure this choice was taken seriously, he would occasionally select a city that offered stubborn resistance and turn it into a poster child for total destruction. In such cases, once the city fell, the Mongols would systematically slaughter every living thing: men, women, children, even the cats and dogs. They would pile the heads of the victims into massive pyramids, categorized by rank or gender, outside the city gates. Then, they would raise the buildings to the ground, diverting rivers to wash away the foundations, so that not even a memory of the city remained. Crucially, they would allow a handful of survivors to escape. These messengers of horror would flee to the next city, their minds shattered, carrying the tale of the nightmare they had witnessed. This was the quintessence of Genghis's strategic economy. He would kill 100,000 in one city to ensure that 10 million in the next 10 cities surrendered without a single Mongol casualty. Even more insidious was the use of the Kharash, or human shield. When the Mongols attacked a city, they would round up the inhabitants of the surrounding countryside, the brothers, fathers, and sons of the city's defenders. They would force these captives to march at the front of the Mongol assault, carrying ladders and filling moats. The defenders on the walls were faced with a soul-crushing psychological dilemma: to shoot and kill their own kin, or to allow the Mongols to reach the battlements. It was a tactic designed to trigger emotional collapse within the enemy ranks. It turned the defenders' love for their families into a weapon used for their own destruction. Genghis Khan also excelled at visual deceptions to manipulate the enemy's perception of his numbers. If his force was small, he would order every soldier to light 5 campfires at night, creating the illusion of a massive host. He would mount felt dummies on spare horses to make his ranks look deeper. During the invasion of the Naiman tribe, this tactic caused such panic that the Naiman king, despite having a larger army, lost his nerve and retreated into the mountains, where he was easily picked apart. The great Khan realized that in war, the truth is whatever the enemy believes. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his genius was his use of biological terror, though he likely didn't understand the science of it. During the siege of Kaffa and other major centers, the Mongols were known to hurl the corpses of those who had died of the plague or other diseases over the city walls using catapults. It was a dual-purpose attack. It spread lethal infection within the crowded, unsanitary city, and it inflicted a level of horror that no soldier could prepare for. Seeing the rotting, diseased remains of a human being flying through the air was a message that the Mongols were not just masters of the earth, but masters of death itself. The architecture of terror was built on the foundation of absolute, robotic consistency. If Genghis Khan made a promise, he kept it. If he promised mercy for surrender, the city was protected. If he promised annihilation for resistance, it was delivered with industrial precision. This consistency removed the element of hope from the enemy's mind. There was no room for negotiation, no space for heroism, and no mercy for the defiant. You were either a subject of the Khan or a skull in his pyramid. By the time the Mongols reached the gates of the Islamic world and the borders of Europe, their reputation was a physical weight that preceded them. Kings would tremble at the mention of the name Genghis, and entire armies would dissolve in panic at the mere sight of the small, shaggy Mongol ponies. He had successfully transformed his nomadic warriors into the personification of the apocalypse. He had mastered the art of the bloodless victory, winning more territory through the shadow of the bow than through the bow itself. The architecture of terror was complete, and its roof was the sky, and its walls were the horizons of the world. For the nomadic peoples of the steppe, China was not just a neighbor. It was a mythic entity, a sprawling ancient dragon that breathed fire and smoke from behind the world's most formidable walls. To the Jin Dynasty, which ruled northern China in the early 13th century, the Mongols were nothing more than smelly barbarians, a nuisance to be managed through bribes, internal sabotage, and the occasional punitive expedition. The Jin viewed themselves as the pinnacle of human civilization, possessing a population of nearly 50 million, massive walled cities, a professional army of hundreds of thousands, and a terrifying technological advantage that included gunpowder and heavy, ironclad cavalry. They believed they were unshakable. They did not realize that the outcast they had ignored had spent his life studying the cracks in their foundation. Genghis Khan's decision to invade the Jin was a calculated risk that transformed the Mongol horde from a regional power into a global predator. The catalyst for the war was an act of supreme arrogance by the Jin emperor, Wei Shao. When he ascended to the throne, he sent an envoy to Genghis, demanding that the Mongol leader perform the kowtow, a ritual of absolute submission. Genghis Khan, standing before the Jin envoy, spat on the ground and turned his back. He reportedly said, "I thought the Son of Heaven should be an extraordinary man, but such a puppet as this sitting on the throne. Why should I kowtow to him?" This was more than a personal insult. It was a psychological declaration of war. By publicly disrespecting the Jin emperor, Genghis Khan was telling his followers that the dragon was not a god, but a lizard. He was stripping away the aura of celestial authority that had protected China for centuries. But as he looked south toward the great cities, he knew that his horse archers faced a problem they had never encountered: the wall. The Great Wall of China is often depicted as a single, continuous barrier, but in the 13th century, it was a complex system of earthen ramparts, stone fortifications, and fortified passes. The Jin believed the wall was impassable for a nomadic army. Genghis Khan, however, did not see the wall as an obstacle. He saw it as a prison for the people inside. He didn't waste time trying to batter down the stone. Instead, he used the Mongols' greatest psychological weapon: speed. In 1211, the Mongol army of roughly 65,000 men bypassed the main Jin fortifications by moving through the rugged mountains of the west, led by local guides who had been bribed or intimidated into service. They appeared in the Jin heartland like ghosts, moving faster than news could travel. The Jin generals, paralyzed by the suddenness of the invasion, struggled to mobilize. Their traditional strategy relied on slow, massive infantry movements and static defense. Against the fluid, lightning-fast Mongol Tumans, they were fighting a ghost. The first major confrontation occurred at a location known as Badger's Mouth, Khwarazmian. The Jin had massed an army of nearly 300,000 men, vastly outnumbering the Mongols, in a narrow mountain pass. They believed their sheer weight and their elite iron pagoda cavalry would crush the barbarian upstarts. Genghis Khan, however, recognized that the Jin's numbers were their weakness. He lured the Jin cavalry into a chaotic, swirling melee in the narrow terrain, negating their ability to charge in formation. As the Jin front lines began to buckle, the Mongols unleashed a psychological terror the Chinese were unprepared for. They didn't just fight, they screamed, their rhythmic war cries and the thundering of their shaggy ponies creating a cacophony that sounded like the earth itself was tearing open. The Jin center broke, and the retreat turned into one of the bloodiest routs in history. Tens of thousands of Jin soldiers were cut down as they fled. The iron pagodas were stripped of their armor, and the myth of Jin military superiority lay dead in the mud. For miles, the road to the capital was littered with the bleached bones of the dragon's defenders. But the field victory was only the beginning. Genghis Khan now faced the true test of his genius: the siege. The Jin capital, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, was a fortress of unprecedented scale. It was protected by 3 concentric walls, 4 massive moats, and a garrison of elite troops. The Mongols were horsemen, not engineers. They had no experience with catapults, ballistae, or the complex mathematics of urban destruction. It was here that Genghis Khan performed his greatest act of intellectual and psychological adaptation. He realized that the dragon possessed the very tools needed to slay itself. During his march through the countryside, he did not simply slaughter the population. He engaged in a systematic program of brain harvesting. He captured Chinese engineers, doctors, scribes, and artisans. He offered them a simple, brutal choice. Apply your skills to the service of the great Khan, or watch your families die. Most chose the Khan. Under the direction of captured Chinese masters, the Mongols built a siege corps that became the most advanced in the world. They learned how to build trebuchets that could hurl 300-pound stones, how to use gunpowder bombs to shatter wooden gates, and how to divert entire rivers to undermine city walls. The Mongols were no longer just raiders. They were becoming an industrial army of destruction. The siege of Zhongdu lasted for nearly a year, from 1214 to 1215. It was a masterpiece of psychological strangulation. Genghis Khan didn't launch a headlong assault. He sat back and waited. He surrounded the city so completely that not a single grain of rice could enter. He used the Kharash tactic on a scale never before seen, forcing thousands of Chinese peasants to dig trenches and carry ladders toward the walls under the fire of their own soldiers. Inside Zhongdu, the psychological collapse was absolute. As the food ran out, the city descended into a living hell. Historical records claim that the inhabitants resorted to cannibalism, the living eating the dead to survive another day of terror. The smell of decay wafting over the walls was so thick it could be smelled miles away in the Mongol camp. The Jin Emperor, realizing the city was a tomb, fled south to the city of Kaifeng, leaving his people to their fate. When the city finally fell, the Mongol vengeance was systematic. Genghis Khan ordered the city to be plundered for a month. The magnificent palaces were stripped of their gold and silk, then put to the torch. The fire was so intense that it reportedly burned for a month, turning the city of the middle into a blackened skeleton. Thousands of the elite were executed, and the wealth of the Jin Dynasty was loaded onto thousands of carts to be sent back to the steppe. The fall of Zhongdu was a psychological shockwave that shattered the very concept of the mandate of heaven. If a group of steppe nomads could erase the greatest city in the world, it meant the gods had truly abandoned the Jin. Across northern China, city after city began to surrender. The Mongols had successfully broken the dragon, but more importantly, they had absorbed its fire. They had taken the technology, the bureaucracy, and the manpower of China and integrated it into the Mongol machine. Genghis Khan had proved that his architecture of terror could bring even the oldest and most sophisticated empires to their knees. He had learned that the secret to conquering a high civilization was to use its own brilliance as a weapon against it. He had entered China as a raider. He would leave it as a world conqueror. But as his carts, heavy with gold, and Chinese engineers rolled back toward the steppe, a new message arrived from the west. A distant sultan had committed a grave diplomatic error, an insult to the Khan's envoys. Genghis Khan turned his gaze from the smoldering ruins of China toward the rich, silk-laden cities of Persia. The wrath of God was moving again, and this time he wasn't looking for conquest. He was looking for an execution. If the invasion of China was a calculated expansion of power, the campaign against the Khwarazmian Empire was something entirely different. It was a clinical, industrial-scale execution of an entire civilization. In the early 13th century, the Khwarazmian Empire was the rising sun of the Islamic world, a sprawling, wealthy, and sophisticated superpower that spanned modern-day Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan. Its ruler, Sultan Muhammad II, was a man of immense pride who commanded a professional army of nearly 500,000 men, a force that dwarfed the Mongol horde. But the Sultan made the single most catastrophic error in the history of diplomacy. He mistook Genghis Khan's desire for trade for a sign of weakness. He believed he was dealing with a minor nomadic chieftain. He did not realize he was inviting the apocalypse to his doorstep. The spark that lit this global conflagration was an incident in the border city of Otrar. Genghis Khan, having conquered northern China and seeking to secure the Silk Road, sent a massive caravan of 450 merchants and several high-level envoys to the Sultan, carrying gifts of gold, silk, and silver. His message was surprisingly conciliatory. I am the master of the rising sun, and you are the ruler of the setting sun. Let there be a treaty of friendship and trade between us. It was a pragmatic offer from a man who wanted wealth without the cost of a long-distance war. However, the governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, was both greedy and suspicious. He accused the merchants of being spies, which, given the Mongol yam system, they likely were, and he had them all arrested and executed, seizing their vast wealth for himself. When Genghis Khan heard of this, he still attempted a diplomatic solution. He sent 3 more envoys directly to the Sultan, demanding that the governor be handed over for punishment. The Sultan, in an act of supreme arrogance, executed the chief envoy and sent the other doer back with their beards burned off, a profound and public humiliation in the Islamic world. To the Sultan, this was a display of sovereign power. To Genghis Khan, this was a violation of the most sacred law of the steppe, the sanctity of the messenger. When the survivors returned to the Khan's camp, legend says Genghis Khan went to the top of a sacred mountain. Burkhan Khaldun removed his hat, draped his belt around his neck, and prayed to the eternal blue sky for 3 days. He was not asking for territory. He was asking for the strength to become an instrument of divine vengeance. He descended from the mountain no longer as a mere king, but as the wrath of God. The psychological war began before the first Mongol horsemen crossed the border. Genghis Khan mobilized a force of roughly 100,000 to 120,000 men, a fraction of the Sultan's army. He used information as his primary weapon. He sent spies into the Sultan's cities to spread a single, terrifying rumor: that the Mongol army was so vast that when they reached a river, their horses would drink it dry. He knew that the Sultan's empire was a fragile collection of recently conquered territories, and he exploited the Sultan's own paranoia, sending forged letters to the Sultan that made it look as if his top generals were plotting to defect to the Mongols. The Sultan, paralyzed by distrust of his own men, made a fatal strategic blunder. Instead of concentrating his 500,000-man army into a single, overwhelming force that could have crushed the Mongols, he dispersed them into individual garrisons behind the high walls of his great cities. He believed that no nomadic army could take his fortresses. He was essentially building a series of separate prisons for his own soldiers, and Genghis Khan was about to go from cell to cell. The Mongol invasion was a masterpiece of logistical and psychological shock. Genghis Khan split his army into 4 independent columns, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. But the most terrifying move was performed by the Khan himself. While his sons led armies to the northern and eastern borders, Genghis and his greatest general, Subutai, disappeared. They led a force of 50,000 men through the impassable Kizilkum Desert, a vast waterless wasteland that the Sultan believed was a natural shield. They moved at night, navigating by the stars, carrying water in leather skins, and drinking the blood of their horses when necessary. In a feat of endurance that defies modern military logic, the Mongols emerged from the desert directly behind the Sultan's front lines, appearing at the gates of Bukhara, the spiritual heart of the empire, as if they had fallen from the sky. The psychological impact was absolute. The defenders of Bukhara believed they were being attacked by supernatural beings. The city, paralyzed by the impossible appearance of the enemy, surrendered in days. What happened next was a choreographed display of psychological dominance. Genghis Khan rode his horse directly into the courtyard of the city's great mosque. He demanded that the city's wealthiest citizens be brought before him. He did not shout. He did not rage. He stood on the pulpit of the mosque and delivered a sermon that would chill the blood of the Islamic world for centuries. "I am the flail of God," he told the trembling elites. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." He turned Bukhara into a poster child for his policy of total submission. He spared the common people to be used as laborers or human shields, but systematically stripped the city of its wealth. He then marched the population to the next great city, Samarkand, forcing them to carry the Mongol siege engines. To the defenders of Samarkand, seeing the massive crowd of their own countrymen being driven towards them by the shaggy-haired horsemen, the sight was a vision of the end of days. Samarkand, the jewel of the Silk Road, fell in 5 days. The Sultan's elite Turkish mercenaries, promised mercy if they defected, surrendered. Genghis Khan accepted their surrender, then immediately ordered them all executed. His logic was purely psychological. A man who will betray his king for his life cannot be trusted with a sword. By killing the defectors, he told the rest of the empire that there was no middle ground. You either fought and died, or surrendered and became a slave. The campaign now transformed into a systematic deletion of the Khwarazmian civilization. At Urgench, the battle was so fierce that the Mongols fought from house to house, using fire throwers and naphtha bombs. When the city finally fell, the Mongols were so enraged by their losses that they performed one of the most brutal acts in the history of warfare. They divided the survivors among the Mongol soldiers, roughly 50,000 warriors. Each soldier was ordered to execute 24 people. Then, to ensure the city could never rise again, they diverted the waters of the Amudarya River, flooding the ruins and washing the foundations of the city into the mud. The cities of Merv, Nishapur, and Herat followed. At Nishapur, after a Mongol prince was killed by an arrow from the walls, the Mongols slaughtered every living thing, including the cats and dogs. They built separate pyramids of the severed heads of men, women, and children. The numbers recorded by chroniclers, 1.7 million dead at Nishapur, 1.3 million at Merv, are likely exaggerated. But the archaeological reality is a layer of ash that covers the 13th century level of every major city in Central Asia. The Sultan himself, once the second Alexander, became a pathetic fugitive. Genghis Khan sent Subutai and Jebi with 20,000 men on a manhunt that spanned thousands of miles. They were ordered never to stop, never to give the Sultan a night's sleep. The Sultan died a year later, a broken man on a tiny desolate island in the Caspian Sea, dressed in rags and possessing nothing but the breath in his lungs. The Khwarazmian campaign was the ultimate proof of Genghis Khan's architecture of terror. He had destroyed a superpower with an army 1/5 its size. He had used the enemy's walls as their own coffins, their people as his own shields, and their arrogance as the rope that hanged them. He had sent a message to the world. An insult to the great Khan was an invitation to extinction. As the Mongol Tumans turned their horses back toward the east, laden with the treasures of Persia and the captive scientists of Islam, the world began to realize that Genghis Khan was not a man. He was a force of nature, a storm that had learned how to think. In the chronicles of the 13th century, there is a recurring image that haunted the survivors of Eastern Europe and Russia. The image of a rider who appeared to be part of his horse, emerging from the morning mist like a demon from the pit of Tartarus. To the knights of the West, war was a grand, slow-moving ritual of heavy steel, castle walls, and individual gallantry. They were utterly unprepared for the Ghost Riders, the Mongol Tumans who operated with the speed of a thought and the coordination of a single predatory hive mind. This chapter explores the Great Raid of Subutai and Jebi, a 20,000-man cavalry reconnaissance that covered 5,000 miles and dismantled every European army it encountered through pure psychological and tactical disorientation. The genesis of this campaign was not conquest, but curiosity. After the total erasure of the Khwarazmian Empire, Genghis Khan's greatest generals, Subutai and Jebi, approached the Khan with a proposal: to lead a small force around the Caspian Sea to see what lay on the other side of the world. Genghis Khan, ever the pragmatist, granted them permission. He wasn't just sending soldiers. He was sending his eyes and ears into the unknown. The first psychological shock of the Mongol presence hit the Kingdom of Georgia in 1221. The Georgians were a nation of fierce warriors, led by a king known for his bravery and possessing a large force of heavily armored knights. When they first encountered the Mongols, they saw a small, ragged-looking group of horsemen on shaggy ponies. To the aristocratic Georgians, these looked like insignificant nomads. Subutai used this arrogance as a tether. He performed a masterfully choreographed feigned retreat, leading the Georgian knights on a grueling, day-long chase across broken terrain. By the time the heavy Georgian horses were lathered and exhausted, and the knights' formations had dissolved into a disorganized line, Subutai signaled his reserves. The nomads suddenly wheeled around, their compound bows unleashing a storm of whistling arrows that found the gaps in the knights' visors and mail. The Georgian army was slaughtered not by superior numbers, but by the exploitation of their own ego. The Ghost Riders had claimed their first European victims. The Mongols then crossed the Caucasus Mountains in winter, a feat the local tribes believed was impossible. They emerged into the vast steppes of southern Russia, the home of the Cumans and the fragmented Russian principalities. Here, Subutai faced a coalition of Russian princes who had put aside their internal feuds to face the heathen threat. This coalition massed a force of 80,000 men, 4 times the size of Subutai's command. What followed was the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, perhaps the most perfect example of psychological manipulation in the history of warfare. For 9 straight days, Subutai and Jebi retreated. They left behind carts of valuable silk and gold. They acted as if they were terrified, their discipline apparently crumbling. The Russian princes, competing with each other for the glory of the kill, raced forward in a frantic, competitive pursuit. They became so spread out that the vanguard was miles ahead of the main body. When the Russians reached the banks of the Kalka, exhausted and confident of victory, the Ghost Riders stopped running. In an instant, the chaotic retreat transformed into a rigid, lethal circle of death. The Mongol horse archers began their rhythmic, circular dance, pouring fire into the disorganized Russian ranks. The Russian princes watched in horror as their massive army was chewed to pieces by a force they had been chasing for a week. But the psychological victory was finished with a chilling, ritualistic display of dominance. The captured Russian princes were not beheaded or hanged. Instead, the Mongols laid them on the ground, placed a massive wooden platform over them, and held their victory feast on top of the living men. As the Mongol generals toasted their success and ate their meat, the princes beneath them were slowly crushed to death. This was not random cruelty. It was a carefully calculated message to the Russian people. Your leaders are nothing more than the floor beneath our feet. The Mongols vanished as quickly as they had arrived, disappearing back into the east to rejoin Genghis Khan. But the seed of terror had been planted. For a decade, the Russian chronicles spoke of the Tatars as a supernatural judgment, a scourge that could appear and disappear at will. In 1236, years after the death of Genghis Khan, Subutai returned to finish the job, this time with a massive invasion force under the titular command of the Khan's grandson, Batu. The psychological war reached a new level of industrial efficiency. Subutai realized that the Russian principalities relied on the deep frozen forests and the brutal winters for protection. He decided to turn the winter into his ally. The Mongols used the frozen rivers as highways of ice, moving their tumens with a speed that defied the comprehension of the defenders. They used the Yam system to coordinate strikes on cities hundreds of miles apart simultaneously. By the time one prince heard that his neighbor's city was under attack, his own walls were already being battered by Mongol trebuchets. The fall of the city of Ryazan serves as a grim template for their method. When the Mongols arrived, they demanded a tribute of 10% of everything in the city. When the princes refused, the Mongols began a psychological siege. They built a wooden palisade around the entire city in a single day, a visual message that no one would be leaving. Then, they bombarded the city with firebombs and the severed heads of Ryazan's own scouts. When the city fell 5 days later, the Mongols systematically slaughtered the population, leaving Ryazan a silent, smoking ruin that was never rebuilt. The message to the next city, Vladimir, was clear. Submission is the only alternative to non-existence. By 1241, the Ghost Riders reached the borders of Central Europe. The kingdoms of Poland and Hungary were the frontier of Christendom, protected by the most elite knights in Europe, the Templars, the Teutonic Knights, and the Hospitallers. These were men who lived for holy war, and they believed their heavy plate armor and their faith in Christ made them invincible. Subutai and his commanders orchestrated a simultaneous, two-pronged invasion. One army struck Poland, while the main force under Subutai and Batu moved into Hungary. These two strikes, though hundreds of miles apart, were coordinated by the Yam messengers with the precision of a modern military operation. At the Battle of Liegnitz in Poland, the Mongols faced the flower of European knighthood. As the heavy cavalry of the West charged, the Mongols used a psychological tool that the Europeans described as sorcery. They unleashed a massive smokescreen using damp hay and chemicals, which blinded the knights and separated them from their supporting infantry. Out of the smoke, the Mongol lancers appeared, their light armor allowing them to dance around the clumsy, heavy European horses. The battle ended with 9 sacks filled with the severed ears of the Christian knights being sent to Batu Khan. A day later, and 500 miles to the south, Subutai delivered the killing blow to Hungary at the Battle of Mohi. He used a night attack to seize a vital bridge, then used a flanking maneuver to surround the Hungarian camp. He did not close the circle, however. He left a deliberate gap in his lines, a path that looked like an escape route for the panicked Hungarians. This was the ultimate psychological trap. Subutai knew that an army that's completely surrounded will fight with the desperation of a cornered rat. But an army that sees a way out will break its formation and run. The Hungarians took the bait. They threw down their shields and fled through the gap. For the next 6 days, the Mongol light cavalry pursued them across the plains, picking them off one by one. The Hungarian army of 70,000 was annihilated, and King Bela IV became a king of a graveyard. The Ghost Riders had reached the very edge of the Atlantic world. In Paris and Rome, the churches were filled with people praying for deliverance from the demons who had destroyed every army in their path. The Mongols had won the psychological war so completely that Europe believed the end of the world had arrived. There was no military force in the West capable of stopping them. But then, the wind shifted. A message arrived from the east. The great Khan Ogadei, Genghis's successor, was dead. The Mongol law, the Yasa, required all princes to return to the heartland for the election of a new Khan. Subutai, the architect of the Western nightmare, turned his horses around. The Ghost Riders vanished back into the mist, leaving behind a continent paralyzed by the memory of their speed and the chilling efficiency of their terror. Europe had been spared by a funeral, but for centuries, the mere mention of the Tatars would cause kings to tremble. The shadow of the Mongol bow had covered the sun, and the West had learned that in the face of the great Khan, there were no heroes, only survivors. History is a master of paradox, and there is no paradox more profound or more unsettling than the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. How could a man who had systematically deleted entire civilizations and built monuments from the skulls of his enemies become the architect of the most peaceful and prosperous era in human history? To understand this, we must look past the blood and see the great Khan for what he truly was, the world's first globalist, a man who realized that once the world was broken, it had to be managed with the same cold, industrial efficiency with which it was conquered. The terror was the foundation. The order was the house. This chapter explores the chillingly effective psychological landscape of an empire where the threat of total annihilation created a level of security that the modern world still struggles to emulate. The legend of the Pax Mongolica is often distilled into a single, evocative image. It was said that a young maiden carrying a nugget of solid gold upon her head could walk from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Eastern Europe without ever being molested, robbed, or even spoken to with disrespect. In the 13th century, a world previously defined by constant banditry, local warlords, and the predatory whims of small kings, this was nothing short of a miracle. But it was a miracle born of a terrifying reality. People did not refrain from theft because they had suddenly become moral. They refrained because the punishment for stealing a single horse or even a single piece of silk was not just the death of the thief, but often the execution of his entire family and the burning of his village. Genghis Khan had successfully exported the collective responsibility of his military units into the civilian world. He had turned every subject into a policeman, bound by the paralyzing fear of a law that never slept and never forgave. The cornerstone of this order was the Yasa, the great law of the steppe. The Yasa was not a collection of philosophical ideals. It was a pragmatic operating system for a world-sized machine. It addressed the friction points that usually tore empires apart: religion, trade, and internal corruption. Genghis Khan's psychological genius was most evident in his policy of absolute religious tolerance. He had seen how the civilized world was perpetually bleeding itself dry through holy wars: Christians against Muslims, Sunnis against Shiites, Buddhists against Hindus. He looked at these conflicts and saw only wasted energy and potential rebellion. His solution was a masterstroke of psychological neutralization. He declared all religions equal under the eternal blue sky. He exempted priests, imams, rabbis, and monks from all taxes. He allowed them to pray to whatever god they chose, provided they prayed for the long life of the Khan. By doing this, he turned the most influential and potentially rebellious class of people, the clergy, into the most loyal supporters of the Mongol state. He realized that if you give a man the freedom to save his soul, he will be much more willing to let you tax his body. The Pax Mongolica was a world where a mosque, a church, and a temple could stand on the same street, guarded by the same Mongol sentry whose only religion was obedience. But the great Khan was not just a keeper of the peace, he was a master of the Silk Road. Before the Mongols, trade between East and West was a dangerous, multi-year journey through a gauntlet of tolls, taxes, and tribal raids. Genghis Khan viewed the world as a single market. He realized that trade was the lifeblood of power. Once he had destroyed the walls of the cities that stood in his way, he began to build bridges. He repurposed the YAM system, the high-speed intelligence network, into a global logistical spine. He built thousands of stations along the trade routes there, each protected by a permanent Mongol garrison. He issued the paisa, a golden or silver tablet that acted as the world's first diplomatic passport and universal credit card. A merchant carrying a paisa was a protected guest of the great Khan himself. To touch that merchant was to declare war on the horde. The psychological impact on the global economy was instantaneous. For the first time in history, the risk of long-distance trade plummeted to near zero. Caravans that once numbered in the dozens now numbered in the thousands. Silk from China, spices from India, glass from Italy, and furs from Russia flowed across the planet in a continuous, golden stream. Genghis Khan became the ultimate CEO of World Trade Incorporated, taking a modest 10% cut in taxes and amassing a fortune that made the treasures of the Caesars look like pocket change. He didn't just conquer the Silk Road, he became the Silk Road. Perhaps the most fascinating and overlooked aspect of the Pax Mongolica was Genghis Khan's systematic program of brain harvesting and forced intellectual cross-pollination. When the Mongols conquered a territory, they didn't just take the gold, they took the talent. They had a special category of captives, the Urtu. These were the engineers, the doctors, the astronomers, the mathematicians, and the master artisans. With a chillingly logical disregard for geography or culture, Genghis Khan would ship these experts across the world to wherever their skills were needed. He sent Chinese doctors to Persia to study Islamic anatomy. He sent Persian engineers to the borders of Korea to build trebuchets. He sent German miners into the mountains of Central Asia. He was physically weaving the knowledge of the human race into a single, unified tapestry. The Pax Mongolica was the first time in history that the sum of human knowledge was being exchanged on a global scale. It was the spark that would eventually ignite the European Renaissance, fueled by the printing technology, the gunpowder, and the navigational tools that the Mongols had dragged out of the East and planted in the West. The psychological atmosphere of the Pax Mongolica was one of stifling prosperity. For the average subject, life was better than it had ever been. There was no more war, food was plentiful, the law was consistent. There was no corruption, because a corrupt official was a dead official. But this prosperity lived in the long, dark shadow of the Mongol bow. The silence of the peace was the silence of a people who knew that the wrath of God was always watching. Travelers like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta would later describe the Mongol lands as the most orderly places on earth. Polo marveled at the paper money, a psychological invention that required the people to trust the state's word as much as gold, and the massive, well-guarded warehouses. He described a world that felt modern, a world where the state was an all-seeing, all-powerful entity that provided total security in exchange for total submission. Genghis Khan had proved that terror was a highly effective tool for governance, but only if it were paired with absolute reliability. He created a world where the social contract was written in blood but reinforced with gold. He taught the world that the most efficient way to rule was not to try and change what people believed, but to make the cost of disobedience too high to contemplate and the rewards of submission too great to ignore. As the years of the Pax Mongolica stretched on, the memory of the pyramids of skulls began to fade, replaced by the reality of the golden plates. The world had been traumatized into a golden age. The terrifying genius had finished his work. He had broken the old world of tribes and kings, and in its place, he had created a single, unified, and terrifyingly efficient global organism. The shadow of the Great Khan had become the umbrella under which the modern world was being born. He had won the final psychological war. He had made his enemies grateful for his rule. Death is the only enemy that a great Khan cannot outrun. Yet even in his final encounter with the inevitable, Genghis Khan proved himself a master of psychological manipulation. By the year 1227, the universal ruler was an old man, his face a roadmap of 65 years of constant warfare, his body a collection of scars and stories. He was at the height of his power, the master of an empire that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian. But as he led his final campaign against the rebellious kingdom of Western Xia, he realized that the eternal blue sky was finally calling him home. Most kings, facing their end, would seek to build massive monuments, pyramids of stone to anchor their names to the earth. Genghis Khan did the opposite. He decided to become a ghost. This final chapter explores the chillingly brilliant end of the Great Khan and how he used his own death as a final, definitive act of psychological warfare to ensure his name would rule the world for centuries after his body had returned to the dust. The end began not with a sword, but with a fall. During a routine winter hunt in the lands of the Tangut, Genghis Khan's horse, spooked by a wild ass, reared up, throwing the aging conqueror to the frozen ground. To his soldiers, it was a minor accident. To Genghis, it was an omen. Internal injuries and a lingering fever began to consume him, yet he refused to stop the war. He understood a fundamental psychological truth. If the enemy, the Western Xia, knew that the Great Khan was dying, their resistance would stiffen into a suicidal frenzy. If his own men knew their god king was mortal, the horde might fracture. From his deathbed in a felt tent, Genghis Khan orchestrated his final deception. He ordered his generals to keep his illness a total secret. No one was allowed to weep. No one was allowed to speak of his condition. The Mongol drums continued to beat. The orders continued to be issued in his name. And the war machine ground forward, with its usual terrifying efficiency. He was essentially ruling as a ghost, while still breathing, proving that the idea of Genghis Khan was more powerful than the man himself. His final order was perhaps the most brutal of his career. He commanded that upon the surrender of the Tangut capital, the entire population be systematically exterminated and their civilization erased from the pages of history. He wanted no survivors to witness his passing, and no rival culture to outlast his memory. As the Tangut king came to surrender, Genghis Khan died in the silence of his tent. His generals, following his instructions to the letter, executed the king and his people, fulfilling the dead Khan's will before a single soul outside his inner circle knew he was gone. Then began the most terrifying funeral procession in human history. To return his body to the Mongolian heartland, a chosen elite unit of 2,000 warriors embarked on a journey of nearly 500 miles. But they did not travel as mourners. They traveled as a column of death. On Genghis Khan's orders, every living thing that encountered the procession, man, woman, child, or beast, was immediately slaughtered. The logic was purely psychological and strategic. No one was permitted to know the location of his final rest. The path to his grave was paved with the silence of the dead. When they reached the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, the place where he had prayed before the Khwarazmian campaign, they buried him. There were no markers, no statues, no gold-domed mausoleums. Legend says they diverted the course of a river to flow over his grave, and then ordered 1,000 horsemen to trample the earth until it was indistinguishable from the surrounding steppe. Then, in the final recursive act of Mongol logic, the soldiers who buried him were executed by another unit of soldiers, who were then executed by a third, until the secret was held only by the eternal blue sky. He had achieved the ultimate psychological victory over time. He had become a legend without a location, a presence that could be anywhere and everywhere. But the death of the man was merely the birth of the Chinggisid myth. Genghis Khan had built his empire on merit, but he left behind a psychological legacy of bloodline that would dominate Eurasia for 500 years. He had so thoroughly traumatized and organized the world that for centuries, no ruler from Moscow to Delhi could claim legitimacy unless they could prove they were a descendant of the great Khan. The Golden Kin became a caste of divine rulers. His successors, his sons Ogedei, Tolui, Chagatai, and Jochi, realized that the fear of their father was their greatest asset. They turned his architecture of terror into a religious cult. They kept his Sulda, his spirit banner, made from the hair of his finest horses, at the center of their camps. To look at the banner was to see the Khan. The psychological weight of his name was so immense that even as the Mongol Empire eventually fractured into the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty, the Pax Mongolica held together because the world still believed that the great Khan's law was absolute. Even the most powerful conquerors who followed him, like the terrifying Tamerlane, Timur, were obsessed with his shadow. Timur, despite being one of history's most prolific killers, never dared to call himself Khan because he was not a direct descendant of Genghis. He instead called himself the son-in-law of the great Khan, ruling through a puppet, Chinggisid, prince. This illustrates the ultimate triumph of Genghis Khan's psychological warfare. He had successfully colonized the future. He had created a system where the world could not even imagine a power greater than his own. The psychological genius of Genghis Khan is also written in the very DNA of the modern world. Genetic studies suggest that 1 in every 200 men living today is a direct descendant of the great Khan. He did not just conquer territories, he biologically integrated himself into the human race. He is the most successful biological organism in human history. His legacy, living in the heartbeats of millions who carry his blood without knowing his name. As we look back through the mists of history, the shadow of the Mongol bow still looms large. Genghis Khan taught the world that the most effective weapon is not a bigger sword, but a sharper understanding of fear. He proved that an outcast boy could break the world if he learned how to weaponize the human mind. He was the first to realize that total war requires total organization, total information, and a total disregard for the traditional rules of civilization. He never wanted a monument of stone because he knew that stone eventually crumbles into sand. Instead, he built a monument of memory. He lives in every military tactic that uses speed and misinformation. He lives in the global trade networks he first secured. He lives in the religious tolerance that he proved was a strategic necessity. But most of all, he lives in that instinctive, ancestral shiver we feel when we hear the wind howling across a dark, empty plain. The Great Khan is still out there, in the silence of the hidden river and the rustle of the steppe grass. He won the final war, the war against oblivion. He is no longer a man, he is the eternal spirit, a terrifying reminder that the greatest empires are not built on land, but on the foundation of an unbreakable, terrifying will. The steppe storm never truly ended. We are all just living in the world it left behind. The storm that began on the banks of the Onon River eventually dissipated, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. When we look back at the life of Genghis Khan, we are forced to confront a terrifying reality: that the modern world, our globalized, interconnected, and technologically advanced society, was born in the shadow of a Mongol bow. For centuries, Western history dismissed him as a scourge of God, a mindless force of destruction that briefly interrupted the progress of civilization. But as we peel back the layers of his architecture of terror, we find not a barbarian, but the ultimate architect of the modern age. He was the first to realize that to build a new world, one must first have the courage and the terrifying genius to break the old one. The first great legacy of Genghis Khan is the fundamental shift in the nature of human power. Before the Mongols, power was static. It was rooted in land, in thick stone walls, and in the divine right of kings who had never seen a battlefield. Genghis Khan proved that mobility is more powerful than masonry. He taught the world that an army that can move faster than information can travel is invincible. This realization is the direct ancestor of modern military doctrine. When we look at the blitzkrieg of the 20th century or the shock and awe campaigns of the 21st, we are seeing the ghost of the Mongol Tumen. He was the first to operationalize the idea of total war, where the psychological and logistical infrastructure of a nation is as much a target as its soldiers. He taught us that a war is won by the general who masters the mind of his enemy before the first arrow is notched. But his impact on the human story extends far beyond the battlefield. Genghis Khan was the unintended father of the Renaissance. By forcibly opening the Silk Road and maintaining it with a cold-blooded efficiency, he allowed for a planetary-scale exchange of ideas that had never happened before. The gunpowder that would end the Age of Knights, the printing technology that would trigger the Reformation, and the compass that would lead to the Age of Discovery, all were technologies that the Mongols dragged out of the East and planted in the West. He was the first to create a global supply chain, a world where a merchant in Venice could wear silk from Suzhou and use spices from the Maluku Islands, protected by a law written in a felt tent in the middle of nowhere. The Pax Mongolica was the first draft of the global village. There is also the chilling, Darwinian victory of his DNA. As we have seen, 16 million men today carry his Y chromosome. This is more than just a biological curiosity. It is a testament to the absolute totality of his conquest. He did not just rule people, he subsumed them. He biologically colonized the future. Every second of every day, in every corner of the globe, the heart of the Great Khan still beats in the chests of millions. He achieved the ultimate goal of every predator. He became the ancestor of the very world that tried to destroy him. Yet, we must grapple with the moral dissonance of his genius. How do we judge a man who was responsible for the deaths of perhaps 40 million people, roughly 10% of the world's population at the time? How do we weigh the pyramids of skulls against the golden plates of the Silk Road? The terrifying genius of Genghis Khan challenges our comfort with the great man theory of history. He was a monster, yes, but he was a productive monster. He was a butcher who cleared the forest so that new trees could grow. He proved that history does not care about our concepts of good or evil. It only cares about the will to survive and the intelligence to adapt. As the sun sets over the Mongolian steppe today, the landscape looks much as it did in 1162. The grass still bows to the wind, and the eternal blue sky remains vast and indifferent. There are no great monuments to him in the heartland, no sprawling cities of marble. His tomb remains hidden, protected by the silence of the earth and the ghosts of the warriors who died to keep it secret. This is his final, most brilliant act of psychological warfare. He remains a mystery. By refusing to be anchored to a single place, he became a presence that is everywhere. He is in the speed of our communications. He is in the religious tolerance that we now recognize as a political necessity. He is in the ruthless efficiency of our global markets. But most of all, he is in that deep, instinctive understanding that the world is a fragile place, held together only by the strength of our systems and the clarity of our vision. The story of the outcast who became the universal ruler is a reminder that the greatest empires are not built of stone, but of ideas. He weaponized fear, he systematized terror, and he organized chaos into a global order. He was the wrath of God, the flail of the earth, and the eternal spirit. He was the man who looked at a world of divided tribes and saw a single, unified empire. The shadow of the Mongol bow has not disappeared. It has simply become the horizon of the world we live in. Genghis Khan did not just conquer the world, he defined it. And as long as the wind howls across the plains and the shiver of ancestral fear remains in the human heart, the great Khan will never truly be dead. He is the wind, he is the grass, and he is the silent, terrifying genius that still rules us from the shadows of the past.